Good morning. My name is Deb Kidwell, and I'm with the Midwestern Higher Education Compact, and I want to welcome you to today's MHEC Security Services webinar, Improving Your Cybersecurity Posture. A few quick reminders as we begin. Resources will be made available on the MHEC website post-event. You do have a Q&A button in your Zoom screen, so please feel free to submit any questions that you may have throughout the webinar. And at the end of the webinar, we will be sending you a survey form, and we would greatly appreciate if you would complete that survey and send it back to us so we can improve future webinars. Next slide. So just a real brief introduction to MHEC for those of you that may not be familiar with us. The Midwestern Higher Education Compact was legislative created and serves the Midwest Census region, which is 12 states. We're one of 4 regional higher education compacts, along with the New England Board of Higher Education, the Southern Region Education Board, and the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education. Our technologies program includes a community of institutional volunteers that offer advice and guidance to MHEC, as well as a technology contracts portfolio designed to meet the community's needs. Next slide, please. The technologies community engages our IT innovators, and we also engage specialists from service areas for technology, academia, students, and administration. We help identify opportunities for contracts that serve higher education needs, and one of those opportunities that was identified over the last couple of years was cybersecurity. Our institutions advised us that this was an area where both contracts and education were needed. And so our presenters today are one of our new partners that holds a contract with MHEC, and we're very thrilled to be able to use that partnership to provide this type of educational session. Next slide, please. So what are our MHEC technology contracts? Our contracts are designed to sustain and advance affordable, high-quality educational opportunities through cost savings initiatives. So if you have any questions about our MHEC processes or about your eligibility to use the contract, MHEC staff are happy to help at any time. The primary person to contact for our contracts is Nathan Sorensen, and his information is on the slide, which you will also have access to after the session. Next slide. Today's session is the first of a series of webinars around security services, and so this slide shows you the upcoming webinars that will also be offered. If you would like to receive reminders of these upcoming events, we do encourage you to subscribe to MHEC's Technologies newsletter, which you can find on our website, mhec.org/subscribe. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to focus on today's webinar, which is presented in partnership with Ron Pelletier from Pondurance, and he will be assisted by Lisa Kroll. Pondurance holds a MHEC contract, which, as I mentioned earlier, was awarded through a competitive process. They cover threat intelligence, SIEM, managed security services, consulting services, and training services in the security arena. All of our public and private not-for-profit higher education institutions within the MHEC region are eligible to use the contract. Again, if you have any questions, reach out to any of the MHEC staff or myself, and we'll be happy to help. With that, Ron, I'm going to turn the presentation over to you.
Great, thank you, Deb. And as you introduced Lisa Kroll, who'll be helping me with fielding questions that may come in. And, you know, as always, I like to take questions as they come to mind, particularly as it's relevant. So this is your presentation as much as it is ours. Please, if you have a question at the moment, just go ahead and enter it into the chat, and Lisa will pick that up and we'll get it asked and answered here as we can. So with that, I want to thank everyone for your time this morning. I just apologize quickly. I've been under the weather for the last few days. This is my first day back, so if I sound a little soft or just out of breath, please, I apologize for that. But let's go ahead and proceed. So this is what we're going to talk about today. When we talk about improving your posture, it really is a series of things that have to be considered and understood. It's not just a linear approach to say, okay, we want to get from A to Z. How do we get there? You know, some of the first things, the foundational things, really have to be talked about. And when we start, we want to understand where's my risk, right? So not just jumping into the core risk assessment, but what should I be prepared against? Why am I a target? What's interesting about, I'll just say this about education going from 2020 to 21, and even government, same boat, is that there's been a threefold increase in the number of attacks against the industry. And they're not slowing down here in 22. But when we look at what are the motivations, why am I a threat? I don't have financial information that a bank might have, or government secrets. The reality is that there are multiple reasons why, as an organization, you can find yourself under attack or the victim of a cybercrime. It doesn't have to be because of a financial consideration. Now, let's be sure that the most of the motivations are financially driven, but there are some other things that need to be considered too. Now, what I've listed here, and I'll go through these, are really the key motivations, excluding cyber warfare, from the mix. But let's take a look at this so that we break down and understand that even if I'm a nonprofit or if I'm a Fortune 50 company, I can find myself in the crosshairs of an organization who seeks to do some harm or gain something for themselves. We think about street cred at first, and this is particularly troublesome when you have the ranks of new bad actors that are sort of formulating, or this is the young people maybe in the basements, or those that are just trying to figure out if they can do something or formulate an exploit. And so there's this level of street cred, that can be gained, among them to see, hey, I wonder if I can do this. I've read about this, or I've got this tool. I want to see if it works. And unfortunately, they do a lot of damage in the wake of what they effectuate. So that's one, clearly that has to be taken into consideration. There are those that aren't looking to gain necessarily, except for their own ego and to brag among their peer groups. Hacktivism, denial, and service. This is a real one, especially now. We've never been in a more polarized world than we're in today. And so if somebody doesn't like what you are, what you stand for, or what you do, then they may try to, the word cancel you by impeding your ability to deliver your message, to function as an organization. So this is something that is very real. We've seen this play out, particularly in the last couple of years. And I'll show some examples, some case studies against these as well. And then we have steal and use your data. We're really taking an angle here relating to corporate espionage, because if somebody can take what you have and not have to spend the money on research development or extend the time, to be able to get where you're at, then that gets them immediately up to market share, or up to the market and gain market share in that way. So being able to steal your data, your crown jewels, your formularies, your patents, your designs, even your methods as an organization that's out doing certain things. Universities especially, you have a lot of intellectual property that needs to be considered, identified, and this is a very real threat. Steal and sell your data. This is the one that everyone thinks about from a traditional, systemic bias perspective, where this is what bad actors are out to do. They're out to steal your identities so that they can resell them on the dark web. It is a very real occurrence. Now, a lot of these are being done in tandem now, and I'll talk about that, when I get to holding your data hostage. But the reality is too is that this used to be one of the primary goals of a bad actor. The reality is now there's a lot of supply that's out there on the dark web. Credit cards now, the reality is a couple of things, because there's a lot of them out there, and the fact that the fraud alerts are a lot more sophisticated and can get triggered easily, that a credit card may be going on the dark web for something like 19 or 20 cents. It's pretty amazing when you think about that. But this is still a very, very real threat. It's not going away. Now, steal in your CPUs and bandwidth, your computer power, essentially. we're talking about here is a process called crypto mining. Essentially, if you think about these cryptocurrencies, and more and more, the world seems to be going this way. There are those that want to go out there and mine cryptocurrency. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole blockchain procedures about that, but just rest assured that this process, it takes a lot of computing power. It takes a lot of utility power. And if I can steal that from somebody else over 100 or 1,000, 10,000 different environments, then I have no overhead. So it's an outstanding business model if I can accomplish that, albeit malfeasant. So, but that's something that has to be considered, especially as the price of cryptocurrency tends to spike upward. You see more and more bad actors trying to get into this game. Steal your money. This is more of a direct, theft where they propagate fraud. Where you may have seen emails. This is the CEO. Send me gift cards, or send money to this account right away, or posing as a vendor. Our last invoice for X amount, send to this new account. It doesn't even have to be specified an amount. I could just look up on the web, oh, they're doing business with this group. Let's send a fake invoice, send it to this count. And now that's happened in numerous cases. And then, of course, hold your data hostage. And, anymore, it's not just encrypting your data. So we think about ransomware, what we've come to know it to be is essentially a bad actor group getting a level of domain access by which they can effectuate an entire lockdown of your system by encrypting your data and then demanding a ransom in return. We're still seeing that. We're not seeing any slowdowns. We're seeing some groups. We've seen one group, bad actor group called Karakurt, that is really made an art of extortion and extraction, or extraction and extortion, where they're not bothering to encrypt, but they still have the same capabilities that a traditional ransomware actor that is out to encrypt might have, and bring your system down, where they might just take the data and say, hey, look, we know you're going to be made good by insurance. We're going to hold this data hostage, but if you pay us, then we'll promise you that we're going to delete it, right? And so there's a lot of, well, why would you do that? You're already in a regulatory pinch. But the reality is there's some let's put it this way: you're put in a position where if you don't pay the ransom, you're almost assured that the money is going to, or excuse me, that the data is going to be released to the public. If you do, well, you're taking a chance that hopefully they won't. Now, I'm not advocating, nor am I, saying anything about paying, the ransom. That's a business decision. There are those that say it shouldn't be done. And it may not be the right choice, but it may be your best choice depending on the circumstances. And so that's why we're going to talk about some of the ways to be able to put yourself in a position and not have to go through any sort of ransomware, encrypted, or extortion type of attack. So these are the main attacks that you're going to see that are propagated by bad actors. Now, here are some cases that you can look at that have to, that maybe align with this. Now, there are plenty more updates, and we're going to continue to update these as time goes by. But one of the more recent ones with respect to hacktivism, denial of service. Now, I should say in that Kellogg's didn't have an outage, of their network. But what did happen in this past December is, if you recall, the labor strife that they were having with some of their workers, and they were starting to hire replacements in lieu of the union workers that were on strike. That caused a lot of consternation among folks and social justice warriors and those that are out there that wanted to do some harm to Kellogg. So what they did is they flooded their HR intake site, the resume intake site with fake resumes that really essentially stymie their efforts to bring on more workers. So a very real case where you can see that play out. There are many other cases too, but it's something to look at. What type of business am I? And if somebody doesn't like what I do, what I stand for, then that becomes something I have to really understand, take a look at, and understand who my potential threat actors might be. So we'll go down through these. I won't read them by um, you see the words up here, and these slides will be available to you. I think what's interesting, though, from the ransom perspective, is that we're talking about attacks now at the rate of every 11 seconds something is attempted, and this really was seen to play out at a cost of 20 billion. I think we'll find when the tally is done in 21 that we'll have exceeded probably that amount in terms of overall damages. So let's look at some of these common cyber attacks and a little bit more by the numbers. Now, what I'm going to show you are each of these, and I'll say that none of them are really mutually exclusive. All of these do, in some cases, work together in some way by threat actor groups. So when we talk about one happening at a rate of every 11 seconds, again, that's reality. That's the reality that we find ourselves in. Why? Because it's lucrative, because it works, because there are a lot of organizations out there that provide an opportunity for an attacker to exactly do that. Doesn't matter what industry you're in. If I can keep you from operating and I can exact a toll or a ransom, from you to do that, then it's good for me. And well, it's not so good for you, but maybe insurance will make you whole, and that is something that they certainly are considering. They really don't care. The only reason they care about insurance, frankly, is that's allowed them over time to inflate their demands, the amount of ransom. Whereas maybe even 3 years ago, we're seeing typical ransom amounts in cryptocurrency demands like Bitcoin that might equate to about $50,000. We're seeing them in the high six figures, sometimes in seven figures, easily in the $1 million range. And that is something that companies are having to deal with. Very much speaks to cyber insurance, which we'll touch on briefly in this. But as we looked at things like phishing exercises, so somebody is going to maybe use email as a perfect conduit to be able to facilitate this, whether it's a bad link or an attachment, something that is in the email that is going to misdirect you or otherwise cause you to incite what's called a business email compromise, which will then take its toll, in certain ways, depending on what the actor's designs are, which may lead to, of course, a ransomware event. And we talk about malware, which is essentially malicious software, traditionally known more as viruses or Trojans or something like that. Now, while these on their own, again, the execution of a code provides a little bit of more of an automated, type of attack. It's very much incited by humans, right? And so all these together, though, using email maybe as a wedge point, dropping in malware once you get a foothold, and then finally effectuating the ransomware are all, you can see how they can be certainly put together. And one of the most common, that we see too, human error and misconfiguration. There's a great deal of this that is brought about more and more. We see things that are in play, like let's just pick on one, I guess. What's called remote desktop protocol (RDP) runs across on a firewall on a port that's numbered 3389. Now, if I present that to the internet, essentially what it is a path from the internet to a specific asset within my network. It has to traverse through the firewall, and it's usually protected by credentials. But what that does, it presents a door to the outside that can be knocked on constantly. And if I can get through it, either by guessing the password, using maybe a default or some kind of automated attack, a brute force, type of attack, and there aren't additional controls on it, then that provides me a direct path to the soft center of the network where I can then continue to move laterally and ultimately do what I want to do as an attacker. But we see a lot of this, not by because there's a general level of incompetence among IT, but in the rush sometimes of getting things to work and run, which is the higher demand that's at hand. Making sure email works, making sure the internet works, making sure these applications work. There's a rush sometimes to get that done, and sometimes rules are put in. Oh, let's just do this temporarily to let this happen, but maybe it's not sunsetted, or there's not a time-based factor that's going to close that down. And so that's where you see a lot of times errors happening, or even vulnerabilities in third-party software. What we're seeing right now, interestingly, we've seen this uptick in our security operations center and our research teams here, particularly at the end of 21, as groups like Caracurt have come along. We're seeing more and more because of authentication at the network has been bolstered by things like multi-factor. And I'll talk about that a little bit more if you're not sure what that is, but it's essentially more than just a password. Because that's thwarted their attempts to compromise passwords, what they've done is they've gone after subversion of network edge devices like VPN appliances. We're seeing more and more groups like Caracurt that are spending time to find what are called zero-day vulnerabilities, essentially a vulnerability that has not been seen in the wild, right? It's previously unseen or unknown, therefore there's no patch against it, nor are there indicators of compromise that are readily available. So nobody has seen this attack, or this vulnerability rather, and an exploit can then be developed that allows them to subvert that and come into the network. So we're seeing more and more of that. That's why security always has to be looked at as a balance, right? A balance of controls, a lot of interacting or intersecting things. You can't just rely on one thing. So vulnerability management becomes a big piece in this, and we'll talk about that at the end. Not only that, but third-party vendors. Let's talk about them as a service provider. Not implicating them in any way, but if you spend your time and efforts to develop great, strong policy on your network to make sure that unique user IDs, we've got strong passwords, we've got multi-factor, we've got good vulnerability management, right? You've lowered or lessened or reduced your attack surface, so to speak, the opportunity that a threat actor might have to exploit you. If a vendor or a service provider isn't exercising the same control, but you've given them access to your inside, then that could create a direct weak link. So it's very important to make sure you're looking at third party controls as well, those that have interaction with you, that have a direct login. So very important. These are all things that work together. So we talked about the threat activities or the potential exploits. Now we've looked at methods. So now it's time to say, well, how do we combat that? How do we make sure that we can lessen the likelihood? When we look at security, and this is the primer slide here, the thesis for security, what we're trying to do, really three specific things. We're trying to promote and sustain confidentiality, right? Limit the access that somebody might have to even view certain data, right? It goes along the lines of privacy. Integrity. We want to make sure data doesn't change, it's not altered, that it's acting or interacting or being processed, transmitted as expected, and can't be interrupted, can't be deciphered, things like that. Encryption is a great method to ensure integrity, right? And then availability. Sometimes this one gets put to the side a little bit, but if I can't operate, if I'm down, as an organization, there are real dollars, that are at stake, or there are real lives that are being impacted, right? That have to be, considered. So the CIA triad is really what, creates the main objectives, the tenets, if you will, for cyber security. And then as we start to understand those, let's talk about framing the program. Now, when we're talking about framing a program, we're trying to talk about bringing in the right mix of technical controls, procedural controls, administrative controls. We have to make sure, again, we have these interlocking, types of controls, that it's not a linear approach or a single stream, right, that creates a gap that can be circumvented. We want to make sure we have, this redundancy, if you will, and even controls that can work together in a system. But being able to effectuate the right type of program is important by using something like a framework. We're really bullish on the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, the CSF, because as a framework, it lists about 135, 136 control functions, essentially, that talk about things like access control, about administration or governance, about encryption, about the ability to monitor or detect, be able to respond, and recover your operations. So it is an entire gambit of things that can be brought into your organization, formulated, and then put into place in the form of policy and other procedures that can ensure continuity and consistency. So that's what we're really talking about, is this fundamental starting point to be able to right size your investment. If you start just buying technologies because, well, I've heard this is good, I heard this is good, I heard this is good, you've got a great collection of tools, and you've probably eviscerated your budget at that point. You really have to make sure that you take that time to understand, what it is. Again, am I fighting against what it is that I have? And then let's make sure we put the right controls in place. So being able to right size it, not trying to be, a zero defect organization. And I do have a slide in here that really illustrates what I'm talking about by not trying to be Fort Knox. And we'll come back to that. So how do I get there, though? So when I talk about this framework, that's great. What are my challenges? And here's the reality: is that if we start looking at these, I'm not going to read each one of these, but there's a great level of challenge. New compliance requirements coming out all the time. There's already a dearth or scarcity of security talent that's out there. Can I really afford to have security people on my bench, or do I just rely on this IT person as a jack of all trades? Right? It can be a combination of different things, but involving a third party makes a lot of sense. This is something that they do on the daily, and they can become great partners. So I'm going to center on this middle one here, where I said technology alone can't deter motivated attackers. And here's something at Pondurance that we like to say, is that our adversaries are human. You have to counter humans with humans. You can't use technology as a single factor, because people will circumvent technology, right? You put up a wall, I'm going to climb over the wall. You put wire over the wall, I'm going to get a bigger ladder and climb over that wire, right? You put something else above, I'm going to go under. So humans are notorious for circumventing technical controls. And so we need dynamic thinkers, right? Technology is a great enabler, but think of it as that. It's an enabler that is to set us up as, a better thinking, faster thinking, better understanding, channeling the data, the information that's at hand, so I can make better decisions in a more timely manner. And we think about new compliance requirements and regulations, you're seeing more and more that not only are they saying, here are the types of controls that we want you to have in place. Try getting cyber insurance, for instance, without implementing multi-factor authentication these days, or even having a managed detection response companies. Some of the insurance companies are demanding that you bring in a third party to do those sorts of things. But what we're seeing more and more as well is, what is the security competency within your organization? Now, here's what I mean by that, and here's what they mean by that, frankly, is we're not suggesting that people in IT are incompetent by any stretch, nor will they never be competent in security. But security is a discipline into itself that has to be thought about in multiple layers, multiple levels, that having a chief security officer, chief information security officer, if you will, or an IT security director, something of that is the person in the organization that is responsible for making sure that security is a discipline, is enabled throughout the organization, and that it is sustained, is something that is more and more being required of organizations, either through regulatory mandate or like I said, to qualify for things like insurance. So making sure that that competency is brought forward, it's carried forward, it's sustained are some very important things. A lot of other things here that create pain points, to be able to, to take into consideration, I guess, that can certainly thwart best efforts. But let's look at things. When we start with this risk analysis process, what are we talking about? We're not talking about just evaluating controls. A lot of organizations will say, let me run you through this checklist. And if you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this, you should be okay. It really starts deeper than that. I'm going to concentrate just on the bolded terms here. Let's understand, first of all, what do we have? What is the type of data? What is the type of system? What is our type of operation? What do we have and who would want it? Remember the motivations I talked about a little bit earlier that outlined, why somebody might go after you, right? But there might be some very specific things that outsiders might want from you. So that's the first thing. What do you have? Who would want it? Let's think again. What are the threat actors that might effectuate some of those, that are under those motivations that we outlined? Who would want it, as a school, for instance? I've got students, I've got to I've got to contend with that might want street cred. I might have, angry groups, that don't like the politics of the school that might want to try to take us down. I have threat actors of opportunity that are out there that might want to effectuate ransomware, right? So who would want to do us harm? That really has to be considered. Now, let's talk about data or, systems that if that does become the focus, where does it live in your organization? First of all, where ought it live? Maybe you have a specific, place in your network that you say, this is where all confidential or private, data must reside, and making sure that you put controls in place that it does all remain there. It doesn't leak out into places that are not intended, that maybe it's not in email if it's not supposed to be, there's no level of encryption, and that it's not just passed back and forth, with, maybe USB sticks that are unencrypted or other mobile devices like that. What if it does live on a laptop device that somebody takes home every night? Again, there are things to mitigate, the risk associated with that, but you have to think about this before you just start saying, let's encrypt everything. Let's make sure that we go through the process to understand what ought to be encrypted, what should be, what am I trying to thwart? And then that's a lot of times predicated on what's the loss? What if I am breached? What if data is lost? What if assets are taken down? What is my impact as a business if I can't function? So going through that process of now what's the impact? And then how do I protect it? That leads you down ultimately to, okay, I know now what my level of risk is, and now I can also establish what my risk tolerance is. I can say, this is how much I want to spend on security because I can, this is what I'm trying to protect. This is what I think I need to do. This is how much it's going to cost me. And it leads you down a path to say, this is how protected I need to be. We talk about risk tolerance. Let's visualize that for a moment. There's really two spectrums, right? I'll take you to the top here and talk about Swiss cheese, right? Nobody wants to be Swiss cheese. That's porous, right? That assumes that you're head in the sand, right? You're not doing anything to effectuate any type of control about security. Nobody's there anymore. Conversely, Fort Knox, that might suggest you're trying to prevent everything. And that's something that you just can't do as an organization. If you try to prevent every breach from happening, no matter how far-fetched or how technical or complicated it might be, then you're going to leave yourself wanting or disappointed in a lot of cases because it creates a lot of expense. It creates a lot of maintenance, right? And communications aren't really happening freely among your systems. It's not efficient. You're going to spend more money on trying to maintain a level of security than you might otherwise have within your budget. Do we have a question, Lisa?
We do, Ron. Yeah, and this came up. It's a really good one related to the Log4j vulnerability that was disclosed in December. The question is, the Log4j has really stressed our understanding of our technology inventory on the campus. The devices that come online and go offline at random times that we miss in our vulnerability scanning. The scanning software has more and more to scan for and takes longer and longer to complete. Is the best way nowadays to go start scanning the device when you give out the IP DHCP as they come onto the network?
Wow, it's a great question. It can be a great strategy. It really depends on how many IPs we're talking about, how many devices we're talking about, and frankly, the human resource capability I have to be able to manage those. So if you're going to rely on that as a control, then do you have somebody that's dedicated to do that every time there's a change in my network, a new asset gets added, right? There are ways to automate that in some cases. Now, that's one way, to go about it. Right. I mentioned managed detection and response as a solution that, can look at your network 24/7. And by implementing indicators of compromise or attack, for instance, if we're seeing that on if we're monitoring an organization on a 24/7 basis, we're going to see if there are weaknesses that are brought about by Log4j, for instance, and then bring those to the attention of the organization. So it's more of a dynamic level of detection, but it certainly provides eyes on, and hones in on things that a vulnerability scan may have missed. Right. So it just depends on how much effort you're trying to put into that. But being able to locate, detect, and isolate, Log4j vulnerabilities are, certainly can become a challenge, for a lot of organizations when you have a dynamic level of addition and contraction of resources or assets on the network. So not really a great answer, except to say that, it's a method. It certainly is something to try. You just have to keep in mind, can I sustain that? Can I make sure that I can rely, effectively on doing that? Or am I just going to be doing scans constantly from here on out? So back to this chart. Again, can't be Fort Knox. It's not tenable. That's the bottom line. I want to find somewhere here in the soft spot, where I'm going to spend this much on security. This is the type of automated control, that I might need, the type of technologies that I might need. This is the type of procedures. I'm going to make sure my procedures in terms of control operations, that this is the way that they are reflected. Now, people always say procedures, policies, that's just documentation. Well, here's why I really believe in policies and procedures when they're done right. And I'll throw standards in there as well. The policy statement is really management's intent. That is not going to change, very much. We will do this, or we shall do this, or we this, and this, from an intent, right? It doesn't provide, much. It just says, hey, here is essentially a cake that I want to bake, right? Now you have standards. Here's how I'm going to measure that. So passwords, for instance, here's an easy one, are going to be, 14 characters long. They expire every 90 days. They have to be complex. They can't be used in, the same one can't be used for more than a year or two, or back to back, or things like that. Those are standards that can be put in place and measured, right? Those are the ingredients. Now I've got the procedures. This is how I'm going to implement this. So if I'm going to implement authentication, these password policies, whether I do it through my centralized Active Directory or whether I have to manage individual applications, it doesn't matter. I'm going to apply this in this way. That's the continuity. That's the consistency. That's the recipe, right? So policies, standards, procedures, if you document those, yes, the procedures may change with more frequency than does the policy, but it gives you the ability to stay on top of things. And if there is turnover, if there are new people, or if there are new groups, brought in, then you can rely on that documentation as a fallback, a way of doing things. So that's the best way to visualize from a risk tolerance perspective. Excuse me. One other thing, as we look at, a lot of organizations sometimes will chase compliance, right? Here's the risk I have. I got to make sure I can check this block, making sure that regulators aren't going to, get me for, for anything, or find me, or otherwise find, fault in what I'm doing. And what happens is, if you situate only on a certain scope of systems, right, and the other systems that are all interconnected, are either avoided or saying we don't have to worry about those, then what you have is a lot of unseen risk that can certainly creep up and create a lot of it could create a hole. It could create a direct link into your environment. So look at Security 360, and this includes not only what's in your purview, what's in your environment, but what are the extensions of systems in my network, cloud systems, which are great, right? The cloud has become more and more, of an asset in terms of not transferring risk necessarily, but you house that, you contain that, you manage that. I'm going to connect to it. I'm going to, send my data back and forth, but I don't have to worry about the management, of that. But you still have to worry about the data that's going to it, right? To hold the cloud provider accountable, or at least be able to see, right? You're not going to be able to go in and audit Microsoft, right? But if you can at least see through them publishing either attestation reports or how they demonstrate or otherwise talk about their security and privacy, those are things that can help bridge your gap and give you peace of mind. If you're interacting directly with the service provider in which they have interactive or dynamic access to your systems, you have to be a little bit more granular in terms of what they're doing, what they're capable of, and making sure that they're not using the same IDs and passwords, and that those do follow the same policies. We've seen cases, I kid you not, where organizations have been breached, where a third-party service provider had a password that didn't change for something, I think 15 years is what the report or the analysis yielded, and it was the same. It was the same one. And think about all of the people that have left that organization and have retained knowledge of that password. That ending up on the dark web somehow. It's no wonder why that those credentials were known and why the organization was breached. Oh, and guess what? At the time, no multi-factor authentication to be able to keep them from just using a single password. So those are some things that have to be considered. Look at Security 360, not just what you think is the most important. Okay. So understanding some of these practices, you're going to hear terms out there. The traditional one that you probably heard a lot is either SIM or Security Incident Event Management, which is a tool. That's what a tool is. A lot of times SIMs are used by MSSPs, a managed security services providers. There's a lot of providers out there that provide management of that SIM. They will look at alerts that are generated by that SIM, and respond to them by creating tickets, or here's what you need to do to be able to stop this. And there's not a lot of dynamic interaction. There's not a lot of side by side, sitting. It's just, oh, we've enhanced this alert and we're sending it to you, and you need to now deal with it. What the organization or the industry, I should say, has recognized is that that's not good enough, right? I've got multiple layers. I've got all of these different, intake systems, or data's moving at different layers. It's moving at the network, in and out of my network. It's moving within my network. It's also moving from the host, and I've got a lot of things happening at the host. Which I'm talking about, the host is the individual computer, the individual server, that all of these comprise essentially a network environment. I have to look at all of these different layers, and I need to use technology to be able to channel all of that data so I can make sense of it. I need to correlate all of this machine data coming in. I need to make sure I'm considering threat intelligence, and implementing this high fidelity monitoring essentially to cut through the noise. And I need some confirmation about whether or not this alert is truly something I need to take action on. So enter managed detection and response. And the way Pondurance does this, again, we're operating at all levels, but we're also ready. We're on the precipice of a response at all times, right? Our SOC and our incident response team, albeit separate, they're very much integrated. And so if we need to go from an alert to an incident, we can do that expeditiously and work with you as an organization. But being able to have that, again, that high fidelity monitoring, that dynamic detect capability that offers some level of prevent, right? At the host, I want to use, maybe a strong level of malware protection, or something along those lines. So I want that prevention, but I need to be able to think dynamically, or have people, humans, analysts that are using technology to be able to identify something that's happening and be able to thwart it before it becomes a full-blown incident. So at a high level, that is really essentially what we're talking about with MDR, managed detection and response, versus the traditional way of doing things, MSSP. Now, these are both third-party providers. You, as an organization, may maintain your own security operations center. I'll go back to the risks about, do I have the right resources? Do I have the number of people? Can they concentrate on that? So doing this yourself can be a very difficult endeavor just to be able to maintain those resources, but it's not undoable, right? You just have to understand what it is you're trying to accomplish. I talked about this high fidelity monitoring and this ability to ingest logs at various levels to be able to say, okay, here's how we make sense of this. Now, I will say that our team, our SOC, we take in, by all of this high fidelity monitoring, billions and billions of events every day that are, packets of information that are going across. We can't get eyes on billions of events every day. So we need technology. We need technology to distill that down, throw out the noise, decipher what we think is real. And that might generate, we might go from 1 billion to, let's say, 100 events in a day, that might work or might warrant extra eyes or analysis, a hunt, if you will. So now we have an analyst that's going out to try to confirm, is this real, or is this something that is allowable, or a false positive? It's not something I need to be concerned about. And from that 100, there might be 2 events that, okay, these are alerts we're generating, and we're now working with you as an organization side by side to be able to thwart this from becoming a full-blown security incident, or certainly a breach. Now, that's a simple way of distilling this down into something where we're ingesting all of this data from these different points: the network, the endpoints, the individual computers, the users as they input or log in or introduce new assets to the network, the cloud, all of these systems that are maybe indirectly connected, by which I'm feeding data back and forth, mobile applications, servers, and other things. All of this I have to consider as part of my threat landscape now, my attack surface, if you will, to understand what's happening so that I can hone in on what I should really care about and then take the appropriate actions. So I'm not going to go into the slide too much more than that. This is what we use. We've developed our own proprietary tools to be able to bring this all in and then create a visual for our customers to be able to see what our SOC is doing and how we communicate alerts back and forth. If something is of a priority, it's not just a ticket, we're creating, right? We are on the phone with you and working to resolve the issue so that we can keep the risk mitigated. This is another way, of saying this is more of a procedural way of what I've talked about. But if you think about identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, these are all of the tenets or the functional areas of that framework I talked about, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And this is essentially breaking it down into your ability to say, what do I have? What's in my inventory of assets? How do I need to prioritize that? Now, how am I going to set out to protect it? What am I going to do from a technical perspective, a procedural perspective? Now I think I've got my attack surface to a point where it's, my level of risk tolerance, is such, and I've got it protected. Now I need to monitor it, because again, I'm not Fort Knox, I'm not this, I'm not closed off, I'm not air gapped, I'm communicating, I'm connected. I still have to make sure I'm monitoring now to see, what these sly, innovative threat actors might be doing. So now I'm monitoring, I'm looking for detection. I'm trying to understand where I might be subverted or, being subverted, and being able to respond to that. And if there is an issue then that you respond to, how can I recover? So these are all of the facets under that provide a process, a security program, all covered by what we call this closed loop incident response. We're taking you from this process. It's not linear, even though it's outlined in a linear way. This is very dynamic, but as soon as we get you to the recovery, then we're going back to, let's make sure, are there new assets in the network? Let's identify. Let's making sure that all the protections are in place, that we're detecting, responding, and recovering. So it's a constant cycle that we bring forward in our solution. Now, let's talk about the relief from a control perspective. I talk about this concept of your attack surface. And again, just simply put, that is how much soft spot or exposure I want to create to the outside or to potential bad actors, let's say. So again, you can't close it off. I can't put a hard protective shell around my business. I've got to communicate. Right? I've got to be out there. So what can I do? What can I do to lessen the opportunity? Most threat actors are opportunists, right? They're going to go. They're walking through a dark alley. Let's say they're going to try gates. They're going to try maybe windows that they can reach or back doors. And if those are locked, a lot of times they're going to move on. If they find something that, oh, I can jimmy this, or I've got, a right here, I can quickly exploit that, then I might find myself then all of a sudden a victim of a cyber crime. So again, I'm not trying to prevent everything. I'm just trying to lessen the opportunity. So how do I do that, right? So this is actually the benefits. I jumped ahead of myself a little bit, but of using that program, talking about right sizing, being able to scale and evolve. How do I need to change as my business changes, as new systems are introduced? How can I make sure that I can move dynamically with that? A balanced control set. I need technology. I need people. I need procedures, and all of those work together as a system. And one thing we like to say, plan to avoid, but prepare to respond. That's the whole concept I just went into a diatribe on about, you can't stop everything. You have to be able to prepare for response. A lot of people like to throw their hands up and say, well, it's not a matter of if, but when. Well, the reality is it's not a matter of if, but when, in terms of you're going to be attempted, an attack, right? Being able to thwart that, though, and lessen the likelihood is where you want to try to be. So don't be Fort Knox, be a little bit better than the person next to you, so to speak, right? It's that old adage, if two people are running through the woods and they're both being chased by a bear, right? Your strategy should be to outrun the bear, outrun the other person, and chances are you're going to be just fine, right? I know it's a macabre way of looking at things, but in security, it's a similar way. Lower that attack surface. I'm going to be where I need to be. I'm going to be better than maybe average, or not just implementing the basic things. Yes, I got passwords, firewalls, and in antivirus, I'm good. It's going to take a lot more than that these days to be able to reduce your attack surface. And that's what we're talking about. So now let's bring the relief here. What are we talking about specifically? I'm telling you what, protecting that domain controller. Now, for those of you non-technical, think of the domain controller as really probably the heart, soul, brains, everything of your network. That is where everything is controlled. If I'm a bad actor and I want to try to do something enterprise affecting like a ransomware attack, I need domain control. I need to be able to move laterally until I get the flag, so to speak. I become a super user on the system. That is ultimately what I need to do to be able to effectuate large scale or enterprise type of attack. If I can take opportunities to protect that domain controller by hardening certain systems, making sure settings are in the appropriate way, that I've got extra monitoring or control and authentication against the domain controller, again, that soft center of the network, then I'm going to be better off than if I just try to take security out to the perimeter. Right. Mobile disk encryption. This is one of those where if people do have assets on their machine, maybe you've tried to train them to say, keep it on the server, or, leave it, at the school or the place of work. Don't bring it on your laptop. The reality is that it's going to happen, particularly people in finance, who might need all of this stuff, on their system if they take it home, or just by downloading it and working through it, there might be sensitive data on there that could be exposed if that laptop is lost, stolen, transferred, or otherwise just maybe sold, if it's not encrypted properly or properly wiped when it's disposed of. But mobile disk encryption is important for that reason. If somebody does lose their laptop at the airport, at a ball game, or at gets smashed and grabbed out of their car, then if I can demonstrate that it's properly encrypted at the disk level, then I'm out the asset, right? That could be painful in itself, but not nearly as painful as if now I've got thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of individual records that were on that laptop that now I need to worry about and be concerned about. It's encrypted. Let's report it. Let's move on. No breach, right? So that's something to consider to again, lessen the likelihood of occurrence. Vulnerability management, man, I could spend the next hour talking about vulnerability management. One of the questions was about a vulnerability management process too. Essentially, day by day, systems, third-party systems are constantly going out of date because new exploits are found. I told you there's this group out there, they're concentrating on finding new zero-day opportunities, vulnerabilities that they can exploit for themselves because there's no counter. Well, there are manufacturers, there are security researchers, there are bounty hunters and others that find these vulnerabilities first, and they do responsible disclosure that can then prompt a patch to be released that can then you can scan for and say, okay, I need to update this patch. So constant scanning of your environment, both the external facing resources, those that are exposed to the internet, as well as the internal resources. I need to do some constant level of scanning. If I just do an annual penetration test. Now, penetration test is a great point in time exercise. That's essentially an ethical hacking exercise that I can pay a third party to do to simulate the actions of a threat actor, right? What can you get to? And by doing that pen test, I can confirm, where my weaknesses might be, which is great. The problem with the pen test is if I wait for a year between iterations of doing one, then I'm good for a year, for, even less than that, right? After the first month of remediation, now I'm exposed again because that window of risk over time continues to grow wider and wider. And if I'm not managing that by doing these scans and applying patches, then I'm exposed, for maybe 11 months, out of the year, more so than I would be if I'm going across and more frequently scanning and applying those patches. Multi-factor authentication, this is a big one. This becomes, maybe a couple of years ago, I would have said, well, this is a great option to have. It's almost no longer an option. If you are remoting in from somewhere else into your environment, into your network, essentially that multi-factor authentication provides more than just a password. Now, there are really three factors, types of factors that are considered in multi-factor, sometimes known as two-factor authentication, but it's something that right? A password, that's something that Now, the other two factors can be something you are, a biometric, a fingerprint, an eye scan, something else like that, or something that you have. Maybe it's your phone that you have programmed or synchronized. Maybe it's a fob or something that's just generating random code that's synchronized with the authentication mechanism. I need to apply not just my password, but one of those other factors to be able to be let in. Now, the benefit of that is a lot of times it thwarts. If I lose my password, it gets compromised. And I'm telling you, it's very, very easy to compromise a password, in this day and age. If I can get that password and there's not a second factor, I'm in. And now I can do what I want. I can start to move laterally, ultimately get to the domain and effectuate what I want to, right? So that's very important to make sure multi-factor is applied. Next generation antivirus, there are several tools out there that really embody this. There's CrowdStrike, there's Carbon Black, there's Silence, there's Sentinel-1. That's the one we're really bullish on because of what it allows our analysts to be able to do in terms of combating attacks, at the host. But essentially, we're talking about a prevent mechanism on the host where it's not working on signatures, which are essentially inoculations that are programmed, that drop in on a daily basis where I get updates and my antivirus works. We're talking about something that works more on the basis of an algorithm or a math model to be able to combat malware. It's trying to essentially understand what it's doing in a more heuristic way. And so it's that much more effective, 90 to 94%, where traditional antivirus is about 40% effective. That's the best you're going to get. I talked about managed detection and response. I'll say it again, you need people to counter people. Don't put all your eggs in a technology basket. Make sure you have a dynamic level of monitoring that you can enable. And then finally, user and awareness training, making sure people understand what to look for. What are some of the indicators of attack that I should be looking for? How do I know if I'm being phished? If something's fishy, no one's ever asked this before, chances are it's probably not right. It's probably something that is setting you up, for an exploit. So making sure you inculcate people with that sense of security. They don't need to be technologists. They just need to be a little bit more circumspect than they might be otherwise, so that they can spot opportunities for those types of attacks. So this is by no means the only list of controls. This is something that you can do pretty simply as an organization to be able to lower your attacks, lessen your attack surface, and be better prepared to thwart an opportunistic attack. So I know I only have 1 minute left, but I certainly will open it up to questions here and stay on.
Yeah, I think with the interest of time and certainly hitting the lunch hour that I'm just going to say thank you so much, Ron and Lisa, for joining us today and presenting all this information. I know it was a lot, and it's an important topic. And for anybody that has any questions about the information, feel free to reach out to us. Again, if you would like to attend any future webinars in this series, just go to our MEC website or contact me, and I'll get you the information that you need. And with that, thank you all very much for attending. Thank you, Ron and Lisa. Thank you, Mary, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Deb,
everyone, for
Mary.
your time. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.